after our chat today. Okay, I'd like to talk to this agenda for just a minute. First of all, at Intel, we have hundreds of engineers working on our products, and Clint and I happen to be lucky enough to get to be two of those hundreds or thousands of engineers working on these products today. Um, and I just really wanted to start off by showing you some of the products we have. Then we're going to go into overclocking capabilities, and then we're going to go into software and technology for overclocking. And then finally, I'm really excited to have Clint share with you some firsthand overclocking tuning for gaming experiences. Now, this is really cool because Clint is not only a member of the overclocking team at Intel, but he's also a pretty serious gamer. I think he's been gaming with you this week. So you get to hear from Clint a lot here when we get to the fourth section today. Okay, so let's talk about um, Intel's real one of our main purposes in the desktop world is to really meet the needs of gamers. And although we're going to talk about overclocking today, I want everyone to know that you can have an amazing out-of-box gaming experience with Intel products without doing any overclocking or tuning. So it's not like you have to buy this and you have to tune it. Um, what what it is that we know that a number of gamers like to tune their system for better performance. Maybe you're trying to get a slightly lower latency. Maybe you're trying to um, tune your system for a game that is lightly threaded, or vice versa. There's all different ways you can tune your system for a particular game. So we want to share with you some of those methods for doing that tuning. And just a little more background before we go forward. Um, about myself. Um, I've had the pleasure of working at Intel for 22 years. I started, as a 21-year-old, so you can do the math. But we played games every day at work. After hours, we would stay play for many hours. And back in the day, again, this will date me, but my games were the Quake series, so Quake 2, 3, and 4. And I learned very fast that um, I can overclock, even though I might not have been one of the more seasoned engineers at the time. I didn't have the best hardware. I could overclock some of that and get a little more performance out of it. And eventually I could get the best CPU and overclock it even further. But by doing that, it actually did help my gameplay. I could actually see frame rates increase. So through that experience, um, I've had the pleasure of leading our overclocking team to create knobs specifically to improve gaming performance, amongst others. So Clint will have the fresher gaming experience to share with you. But as I walk through this, just know that you're getting this from somebody who used to play uh, first-person shooters for more hours a week than I would like to admit. Okay, so let's move on to the next slide. You're ready to buy a new processor and you want to make sure that it supports overclocking. So in that case, you want to buy a processor that has the KSKU designator and a motherboard that features the Z chipset. So today we have i9 KSKUs, and we also have i7 and i5, and then we have the Z490 chipset. If you pair those two together, then you will be able to unlock and have all of the overclocking features that we're going to share today. Of course, those features are that we're going to focus on today are our latest 10th generation. I think Clint might show a few things from ninth generation as well. And what's cool, we've been getting a lot of really nice press about how overclocking is doing great things for gamers. I won't go through that over on the right hand side of the slide here, but it's there for your reference. So without further ado, let's go to the next section of our presentation today, and we're going to talk about the overclocking capabilities and really an overclocking block diagram here. So I'm going to slow it down just a tad bit here as we go through this. Also going to let you know that the moderators, if they see a common question being asked, they'll stop us and let us answer that question. Otherwise, we're going to do the main Q&A at the end, but we would love to be able to answer some of your questions. Okay, so overclocking architecture, what you're seeing in front of you here is a block diagram of the processor on the top, the CPU there, and then down below the PCH. And we'll start at the processor and look at the various knobs that you have to control. Sometimes these we would call a ratio or a multiplier. So if you start by looking at the cores, in this example, we're showing 8 cores. It could be n number of cores, 10 cores on our latest processor. And w- we have a core multiplier that you can change, and that moves in 100 megahertz increments. So you take your base clock, shown down there by the PCH, and you can then multiply that 100 megahertz base clock times the number that you have for your core frequency. So if you had a base clock of 100 megahertz and your core ratio was 40, that's 4 gigahertz. Simple math. And then we can adjust the memory ratio, kind of moving around clockwise to overclock memory. We have the ring ratio, which is represented there by that blue R kind of in the middle of the CPU. And then if you happen to use processor graphics, which I know a lot of folks today are focused on discrete graphics, but there are scenarios where you might be interested in that. You can also overclock the ratio for your processor graphics, and that one increments in 50 megahertz steps. And then looking at the PCH, we have the ability to overclock the B clock itself. So remember before I said B clock times the multiplier equals frequency. So if your multiplier is 40 and the B clock is increased to say from 100 to 110, you would be getting a 10% overall overclock. And we also offer an advanced overclocking capability, which is PEG DMI overclocking, and we'll reference that later. So think of this as these are your primary, most bang for the buck overclocking knobs. Okay, now moving to the next slide here, we can see the voltage controls. So before you are able to be successful in raising the frequency of your processor, you'll need to make sure that you have sufficient voltage to operate at that higher frequency. Kind of makes sense, right? You're going to run faster, you're going to need more power. So we offer these voltage rails. Now, this don't let this chart be intimidating. If you're overclocking the CPU core or the ring, you really have one rail there, one voltage rail that is, and that's that yellow rail at the top called V core. And if you raise that voltage, you'll be able to have more headroom to raise frequencies higher. Likewise, you can see there's a rail for GT, which is our graphics in the processor. And then looking at the very top, you see one pointing at an arrow pointing at the DDR. That's our VDDQ. And that's the voltage to your memory module. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit. Okay, the other rails listed there in red are more advanced overclocking knobs. And we'll just leave those for now. We just want you to be aware that there's always more. Okay, so let's move along and talk about now some of the key what we call overclocking features or knobs. So in addition to setting frequencies and setting voltage, there are these helper knobs, I call them, that help you be successful at different overclocking goals. The first one we've listed here, and I've kind of broken it into two categories: common knobs at the top, advanced at the bottom. Most people, 90% of overclockers, really only need the knobs there at the top. So the first one is AVX offsets, and Clint is going to explain that in much more detail. So I'm going to leave it to him. But that is our most popular overclocking knob. The next knob we have is called per core hyperthreading enable disable, and this will allow you to turn off the HT threads that are associated with each core. And why would you want to do that? So maybe you're in a scenario where the workload you're using doesn't need more than 8 cores and it doesn't need to use hyperthreads. By disabling some or all of those hyperthreads, you can improve your frequency by about a bin in general, and your power consumption can also be as much as 20% lower. So I'm giving you kind of ballpark numbers, of course, as we go through here. Um, there's a lot of variation unit to unit, but that just kind of shows you that there's a lot of opportunity there. Some people love our 9700K processor from the last generation because it did not have hyperthreading enabled, and it tended to get those higher frequencies. Well, you can have a 10 core processor today and achieve the same thing with this knob. And of course, it's temporary, right? So if you play another game or an application and you want those hyperthreads back, you've got them back. The next one is called limited per core overclocking. This one is a little bit complicated to describe, but I'll try and do it as simply as I can. You can associate a different ratio or multiplier with each core on your processor. So if you have 10 cores, you could pick out through all your cores and pick, let's say, two of the cores I want to run at 5.2 because I've found they're really capable, but maybe the other eight I want to run them at 5.1. And so the frequency that'll be granted to the processors is the lowest common denominator. So if only your 5.2 gigahertz cores are active, you'll get 5.2 gigahertz. But as soon as one of the cores that runs at 5.1 becomes active, then all of them would drop to 5.1. So that's why we call it limited per core overclocking. And it's a nice way to kind of tune that last ounce of performance out of your machine. Then we have another knob called ring down bin disable. And like I said, we want you to have a great out of the box experience without having to tune anything. And in doing so, we have the ring always at a one or more bins below the core frequency. But as you're overclocking, you can often get the ring frequency higher. And so by disabling the ring down bin, you can regain some of that ring performance. And then moving into those advanced knobs, we have real-time memory timing controls. So for people who are setting world records, they love using that. Another one called B clock, aware adaptive voltage. And this automatically scales your voltage frequency curve when you're doing B clock overclocking so that you don't have to run a static voltage, which is really cool. Static voltages mean you're running at the same voltage, essentially indefinitely, even when you're idle. And the longer you run at that high voltage, the more reliability impact you have on that processor. And then we talked about PEG DMI overclocking, so you can get a few percentage points of overclocking your graphics card, maybe 2 or 3%. And then we have another one called TJ Maxx offset, which is for those daredevils out there who are maybe trying to set a record with a fixed cooling solution and they want to kind of exceed those maximum temperatures that we would normally permit. All right, so moving along, we're ready to talk about software and technology for overclocking. So let's say everything I talked about just now, you're like, oh, that's too techy, too much wrench swinging, and I don't want to go and try and understand all of these overclocking details. No problem. We have this tool called Intel Performance Maximizer. You can download it if you have one of the supported processors. It will automatically tune your processor and you're done. So it's kind of that easy button for overclocking. We have a link to it here. By the way, everything we're going to talk about today, you can use the generic link of intel.com/overclocking and you can find all this. The other thing we have is something called the Intel Performance Tuning Protection Plan. Again, if you're nervous about getting into overclocking, this might be for you. For as little as $30, you can buy a plan that says, hey, if your CPU gets damaged by overclocking, Intel will replace it for no further charge than your initial $30. That's pretty cool. I think there's a lot of people out there that learned on overclocking on these $500 to $1,000 CPUs, and sometimes you learn the hard way. For $30, you have a really nice, in this example, you have a really nice backup plan there. So this is for anyone who might want to be getting into overclocking for the first time and just really wants an easy path. Okay, so if we move into the next slide here, we are talking about the Intel Extreme Tuning Utility. This is an overclocking application utility, runs in Windows. It's pretty awesome. And I'll tell you, it can be intimidating at first if you're new to overclocking, but don't worry, there's a lot of tutorials, a lot of help out there. But this application does so much. So it does everything from managing all of the overclocking that you can do in real time. All those overclocking values can be set here. It allows you to monitor the health of your system, some of what you see at the bottom of the picture here. You can monitor your temperatures, your processor utilization. You can use it to debug some of your overclocking if you find that you're thermal throttling. It's really got a lot here for you. Um, it also has stress tests, benchmarking, and a really cool feature that I'll share where you can save all your overclocking settings and you can store them to a profile. And then the app profile pairing feature lets you say, hey, anytime the profile I created for first person shooters, anytime I'm playing a first person shooter, Counter Strike's open, it will apply that overclocking setting. And then when I close down Counter Strike, it'll turn off those overclocking settings. And then maybe when you're playing something else, um, another genre, it'll switch to perhaps a different profile. And you can do that by groups of games or by specific games. It's really awesome, and then it takes the knob tuning and makes it so you only have to do it once, and then you can apply that to all your games in the future. So really cool features in XTU. It's a free download. If you have an overclockable Intel processor, you can download it at that link listed here. Okay, and then one more thing I wanted to share is around the um, Intel XMP memory. We call it Extreme Memory Profile technology. So this is really simple. If you want to overclock your memory, all you need to do is buy a memory that is XMP certified on the motherboard and processor that you plan to use. If you do that, you will have none of the guesswork that comes with overclocking. You simply enable XMP in the BIOS and your memory will be overclocked without you setting any detailed knobs or any special configurations. It just works. So I like to say this removes the guesswork in memory overclocking because it just works. And there's you know, a lot of vendors out there, almost a dozen vendors to choose from. Some of the popular ones we have listed on this slide, but it's not a complete list. And then also, if you go to Intel's website, again, you can just go to that intel.com/overclocking and find this. Um, you can get a list of all of the memory that's certified. So you can say, hey, I have this Asus motherboard and I want to buy memory from G-Skill for my 10900K. You find the model number on the list and you place your order. It's that simple. Okay, great. We think we're doing pretty good on time. I'd like to go ahead and hand it over to my colleague Clint to take it from here. Okay, Clint's going to be with us in just a minute here. Thanks for your patience. We'll get that stream reopened.
Sorry about that.
All
Are we
right, Clint.
back?
Oh, well, yep, you can take it away.
All right. A little bit of technical difficulty there. My name is Clint Whiteside. I have been with Intel for about 10 years, and I've been a member of the Pacific Northwest LAN community for about 15 years. Some of you may know me better as Spork, and my involvement with the LANFest events in Hillsboro and through PDX LAN. I've been a gamer for quite a while, and even though uh, like Dan, I may have backed off on that a little bit as I got a job and responsibilities. I still enjoy getting the time to play games as I have time. So I got to play Supreme Commander with a few of you last night, and I hope to participate in the tournament later today. I also enjoy 4X games like Stellaris and Civilization, as well as simulators and RPGs and that sort of thing. So I thought it would be kind of more interesting for me to present um, a practical application of all this overclocking technology and these features that we provide in a way that will improve our gaming experience. Um, so this is my machine that I use for gaming. I bought all these parts, um, and I'll show you how I tuned it to improve my gaming experience. So I'm starting with the Core i9 9900KF. Um, I would very much like to upgrade to the latest and greatest 10th generation, the 10900K. But Intel has been prioritizing getting these in the hands of customers over stocking the employee store. So I'm still waiting and very much looking forward to getting my hands on that. I'm running an EVGA CLC 240 millimeter all-in-one cooler. This is a pretty generic. It's very similar to what most of the manufacturers put out for this, and it's what fits in my case. Um, I went with the ASRock Z390 Phantom Gaming ITX motherboard. There are several good choices for ITX motherboards in this space. I went with the one that had the most robust VRM and Thunderbolt, which was important as the I/O in this ITX form factor is very limited. Um, I have 32 gigs of G.Skill DDR4 3600 megahertz XMP memory. This stuff is fantastic. And as Dan said, you can plug it in, you load the profile in BIOS, and it's gotten you probably 95% of the way to the maximum performance that you'll get out of this memory. Um, for all uh, gaming and productivity type uses. So there probably is a little bit more. I could go and get a little more frequency out of it or tweak a little more in timings out of this. But I've actually just stuck with the XMP profile as that's enough for my needs. I have two Intel 760p SSDs in RAID 0, a EVGA 1080 Ti, which is probably the oldest component in this system. Um, one of these days I'll get to upgrade that. And of course the can of Mountain Dew for scale and to keep me awake in those late night Supreme Commander games. Um, so the reason I built this system the way I did, you can see it's an N case. I wanted this to be as portable as possible for going to LAN parties. I go to uh, probably 8 or more LAN parties a year, and hauling a standard size mid tower was just getting old. So I went with this N case case and the ITX form factor so that I can drop this thing in a Pelican case, put my monitor under an arm, and just walk into the venue. So this is my one trip from the car LAN party PC build. So let's go in. This is my XTU configuration. This is how I have tuned my system. This is how I've overclocked my system. And there are a lot of knobs here. This may seem a little bit overwhelming. So I want to kind of go in and step by step look at some of these knobs, explain what they do, and why I chose them to configure the way that I did. So we'll start with the core voltage mode. Um, so there's three different voltage control modes that you can choose to use when you're overclocking. The first of which is the static or the override control mode. Um, this basically just requests one voltage at all times, regardless of the frequency that the CPU is running at. This is good for extreme overclocking if you've got liquid nitrogen or something similarly extreme and are trying to hit those extreme frequencies. This is great. Your voltage isn't going to move or change at all. However, It's not the best for reliability. You're running your CPU at this high voltage at all times. It's not going to do great. And the it's not the best for the guy that has to pay the power bill, which that's me. So I didn't choose to go with a static voltage control mode. There is a offset control mode where you just set an offset from the stock voltage curve. So if you wanted your voltage to be 100 millivolts higher or 100 millivolts lower from what the CPU would select under stock conditions, you can do that. This is good if you want to mostly use that stock voltage curve with just a slight tweak. Um, but that wasn't quite enough for me to do what I wanted to do with the CPU, so I didn't end up using that. The adaptive mode or the target mode was my choice for this configuration. What this does is it sets a voltage to be paired with your highest frequency, which, as we'll see later, is 5.2 gigahertz in my case. And what it does is it will interpolate, so it draws a line between the end of the stock voltage curve, which is 5 gigahertz for this part, and this new point that you've defined. So my CPU, if it's running in the stock voltage range or stock frequency range, from a low frequency up to 5 gigahertz, the voltage applied will be exactly the same as it would be in a stock setting. And then between 5 gigahertz and 5.2, it will apply more voltage to help me hit those frequencies. So this is great if you're running an overclock system 24/7 to use this adaptive or this target mode to save power and reduce wear on your CPU. All right. As Dan promised, I'm going to talk about AVX offset. That's the knob up in the upper right-hand corner right now. Um, AVX2 instructions are great. They can accelerate a good number of workloads. They're being used increasingly in a number of popular game titles. I think PUBG is one of the more popular titles that uses it a lot. Civilization 6 uses it, I think, for their AI. AVX2 is fantastic. However, the AVX2 instructions, AVX2 workloads, consume more power in general compared to SSE or other workloads that are not using AVX instructions. This can cause your CPU to run hotter at the same frequency, and of course it's consuming more power. Um, it can also AVX2 can require more voltage to run stably at the same frequency as perhaps an SSE or similar workload. Um, so we provide this AVX offset knob so that the CPU will detect whenever AVX instructions have been used or requested, and it will lower the frequency of the CPU by this amount. So I've set an AVX offset of 1, so it'll lower by 100 megahertz, um, so that I can preserve that 100 megahertz of frequency for my non-AVX workloads. So you'll see in a minute my top frequency that I've configured is 5.2 gigahertz. I can't run 5.2 gigahertz stably with this voltage and this cooler for AVX2 instructions, but I can for SSE. So I'm able to keep that extra 100 megahertz of headroom through the use of this AVX ratio offset knob. It's very useful and great to use in these types of configurations. And we'll see a practical example of this on the next slide. And then ICC Max and Turbo Boost. There's a lot that I could say here, but these ultimately are just power limits. Some vendors already max these out by default, but if you're overclocking, you probably just want to get them out of the way so that they're not limiting you in your overclocking. So this is AVX offset in action. So I ran on my machine the Civilization 6 AI benchmark, which uses AVX2 a fair amount, but it does not use it the entire time. So you can see the dots up on the top around the 5.1 gigahertz frequency, the majority of the time I'm able to run at 5.1 gigahertz. So I'm not running AVX2 instructions during this time. Um, and then you can see there are a handful of dots around the 5 gigahertz point where AVX2 has been detected, and it dropped the frequency to allow for that. So really, opportunistically, I'm getting an extra 100 megahertz the majority of the time, even in a title that uses AVX2 a fair amount. So this is just the demonstrating the benefit of AVX offset. So next we get to turbo ratio limits. And I do want to point out, Dan mentioned the limited per core overclocking. So there's a selector knob between package and per core. I'm not using the limited per core overclocking on this configuration, but it is an option that's supported, and you can get to it through XTU. Um, but just at the package level, these are frequency limits per number of currently active cores. So in this case, if I have 1 to 4 cores running, it'll allow it to run at 5.2 gigahertz. But as soon as that fifth core is active and doing something, it will drop the frequency down to 5.1 gigahertz. Um, I do want to point out, I think that the CPU could easily do 5.3 and maybe even 5.4. But I have it in a tiny case with kind of a little bit of a limited cooler. So this is kind of the trade-off that I have because of that. So your mileage may vary, but I think that the CPU could do a little bit better in a larger, less thermally constrained environment. Um, but anyway, going back to turbo ratio limits, you can use this, you can take advantage of this for games or applications that may not use all of your cores at once. A lot of games, especially older games, are not very well threaded. So they'll often have one thread that they peg, at 100% or at a very high percentage, and then maybe there'll be stuff on some other threads. If they bother to do that at all. Um, so you can use this configuration to opportunistically get some additional frequency when you don't need to be using all of your cores. Um, of course, this is affected by background applications, Windows services. If you're running Discord and streaming, and I've even caught, if you leave Chrome and Firefox open, they're always doing stuff in the background too. So you can use if you don't want to close all this stuff, you can use the Windows Task Manager or third-party apps like Process Lasso to affinitize your processes to specific cores and all that to try and reduce the impact. And then lastly, we're going to talk about the cache or the ring. On some processors, this is referred to as the mesh. But this connects your cores together with each other, as well as memory, the graphics, if you happen to be using that, and the I/O, like the PCI Express port out to your discrete graphics card. Um, Increasing the frequency of the ring can decrease the latency of the transactions between cores, from cores to memory, and so on, up to a point. Um, so you can see I've chosen to set my ring to 4.7 gigahertz, and it was stable up to 4.8, 4.9. Wanted a little bit of additional voltage, but honestly, I got most of my bang for my buck at 4.7 gigahertz ring. So I set it there and left it there. Um, the voltage settings for the ninth gen and the 10th gen are shared with the CPU, so that's something to keep in mind. If I had to apply extra voltage to get my cache frequency higher, I would have also been applying that to my CPU cores and increasing my power utilization and my temperatures. All right, so just to show it all at once again, now that we've looked at some of these items and explained what they do, this isn't all that intimidating. Hopefully, so hopefully you guys can go and try some of these things at home. So of course, the overclocking settings is only half of the story, right? You want to be able to make your games run faster and improve your experience, and you want it to be stable. You don't want it to crash out in the middle of a game or what have you. Um, so if you look online, there are multiple schools of thought on how you prove stability. There are a number of people who swear by Prime 95, small FFT. ADA 64 stress is seems to be gaining popularity with a number of folks, and then OCCT has been a popular method as well to stress your system and make sure that it's your settings are stable. The thing with every one of these workloads is that they are far more stressful than the games that I play personally. Um, I have yet to see a game that hits as hard as Prime 95 or really any of these workloads. So my approach is to use Prime 95 small FFT on SSE only, so no AVX instructions, for 30 minutes for both of my core buckets, so both at 5.1 and at 5.2 gigahertz. And you can select how many threads that it runs so that you make sure that you're actually uh, testing these separate buckets. Um, any thermal throttling or any instability is a fail, and then I have to go back and change my settings. I need to raise my voltage or maybe drop the frequency, um, and then try the test again. Um, you can test for longer to gain more confidence. I know there are a lot of people that say, "Oh, it's got to survive for 24 hours. It's got to survive for 48 hours," and that's totally fine. Whatever people feel that they need to do to be confident that their system's going to be stable. I've just found that I get most of the bang for my buck at that about that 30-minute mark, and anything after that it's really just stress testing my cooler. Um, However, for testing AVX2 and to dial in that AVX offset, I do use Prime 95 small FFT with AVX2 instructions to check the voltage and the ratio over a very short period of time. So this machine is small, it's thermally constrained. Um, Prime 95 AVX2 is going to far exceed the capabilities of that small cooler. Um, so if I run it for more than a couple minutes, I'm thermal throttling, and I'm no longer really testing anything of any value. Um, so if I was running workloads that looked like Prime 95 AVX2, if I was doing lots of video encoding or that sort of thing, then I would have increased my AVX offset to decrease the effective frequency that I'm running for AVX2, and then I would of course test longer to verify stability. But I'm using this system for gaming. Um, I'm not encoding video 24/7. Um, these settings that I've arrived at and this means of checking stability, I think are appropriate for that. And your mileage may vary. All right. In conclusion, Intel products provide a great out of the box gaming experience. But if you want to try and improve on that, Intel provides overclocking features and tools to further enhance your gaming experience. I encourage you all to go and give it a try. Download XTU, try tweaking with a few of the settings on your system, and see if you can get some more speed out of it. If you want to learn more about anything we've talked about today, or grab some of the tools that we've talked about, you can go to intel.com/overclocking. All right. I think we have Q&A now. Gonna have
Yeah, for the protection plan, if you go to intel.com/overclocking, you can get there. Also, Clint, if you're able to switch back to the slide, I have a link there on slide 12. We could give you a direct link, but all those links that we gave you, those deep links, those can all be found at intel.com/overclocking. And by the way, I have my phone up here with a bunch of questions. We'd like to go through as many as we can. One person asked, should you use XMP when you're overclocking? That was Stealth 5706. Absolutely. I would not recommend most people to overclock memory unless it's XMP. So yeah, good point there. You definitely want to use and purchase XMP memory when you're overclocking. And there's the deep link to the performance maximizer. And on that same page, you will find the performance tuning protection plan. So another question somebody asked was, can you overclock your SSD? I guess that was also Stealth 5706. Unfortunately, today I'm not aware of any SSD overclocking that's available to the average consumer. Um, 5 years ago, Intel, the overclocking team actually did demonstrate a proof of concept of SSD overclocking. So yeah, we know it can be done, and I wish we could look at that again one day. But you really got to be careful when you have people's data in your hands, and you know, um, we didn't want to cause issues where there would be data lost. I think for a purpose-built machine, you could probably some people might accept that data loss risk, but that's the main reason we haven't pursued that. There was another question. I think the first question we got: are there any softwares that are recommended for OC? And I think that was before Clint presented some of the stress test software, but we definitely recommend XTU, which is free for Intel. Performance Maximizer we recommend. I personally think that in your toolkit you want to have things like CPU-Z and hardware info. Clint, did you have anything else you wanted to add on that one?
Yeah, I think you've hit the highlights. XTU has great monitoring capabilities built in, but if you want something that might expose a few more things, hardware info is fantastic for that sort of thing.
Okay, and we got a question from Chris. What is XTU? And sorry, we might have missed you on that part of the broadcast. Maybe Clint will click to another slide here. This is a graphic image of XTU that you're seeing there, Chris, and it stands for Extreme Tuning Utility, and it's basically the ability gives you the ability to control all of your overclocking features that can be changed in real time. So anything you can do live in Windows, we make available here. It can do a lot more than just overclocking, though. You can monitor your system health. Check what your CPU utilization is, what frequencies are you at. Um, it has a lot of capability. Um, we got another question here from Lucky Noob, and I'm going to direct this one at you, Clint, when I ask it, because I would like you to, if you wouldn't mind, Clint, because we're Intel, we're not going to give a like a guaranteed safe voltage level for overclocking. But Lucky Noob asks, um, is there any guidelines to what values to use for VCore, system agent, I/O voltage when doing a all-core overclock, assuming you want to keep the temperature below 90 C? Maybe you could share from your experience, Clint, on your particular machine.
Okay. Yeah. So personally, on my CPU, I try and keep it below 1.4 volts VCore. Um, that's just kind of the level that I feel comfortable with. VCCIO, I have not needed to touch at all for my configuration. And honestly, unless you're doing some pretty extreme stuff, you probably won't need to. VCCSA, I have done in the past plus 50, plus 100 millivolts there to help with memory overclocking. I didn't need to do any of that here. But that's kind of the threshold that I would accept there.
Thanks. And Target asks, what should you do for system and thermals if you want to overclock? And glad you asked that because we didn't explicitly call it out, but on slide 17 of what we were sharing, it's actually there. So, um, first of all, when you're overclocking, you want to pick a great thermal solution. So, a lot of times that means a liquid cooler. Um, and you want to make sure you have sufficient airflow to your chassis. Once you do that, you also want to purchase a motherboard that has a good voltage regulator. I think Asus is going to talk later, and they might be discussing that. So you want good cooling, you want good power delivery, and then within XTU, there's a few settings. One is the short-term power max, and the other one is the long-term. And those we call PL1 and PL2 internally, power limit 1 and power limit 2. And then there's another setting called ICC max. You can see in this case, Clint has those set to unlimited on his machine. And that is vital to the overclocking that he was able to achieve. So um, good for you for calling that out. Um, that's certainly an important element to overclocking. Boy, there's a lot of questions, so I apologize if we don't get to everyone, but looking down the list here, somebody's having trouble getting to the XTU page. It says page not found. Um, we'll look. Okay, it looks like somebody else responded to that in the chat, and it's the link is up and running now. Okay, Reach the Sky has been really patient in trying to get his question. I assume, well, their question through, and I'm going to try to read it here. It's a little bit long. I think you're sharing your configuration. Reach the Sky. Feel free to, if you can give us maybe a short version of your question, we could answer it. I think you may have just been providing a system configuration. If not, let us know.
Yeah, I
Someone
think
else, go
I
ahead.
think he was asking to rate his overclock or her overclock, their overclock.
Oh, go for it.
And it's yeah, that's pretty awesome. 39, 33, 15, 14, 14, 30. That's pretty great. The VDIM is 1.5 volts, which is a little high for my tastes. But yeah, that's awesome.
Oh, cool. Thanks, Clint, for reading that. It is hard to read and answer questions at the same time. If Shadow Storm, sorry if I mispronounced that, asks what tools will work for the Core i7 8750K processor. 8750K. If I'm not mistaken, that might be one of our mobile parts. And we do, if that is, Clint, if you know otherwise, feel free to speak up. But certainly any K SKU from Intel, you can run XTU on it. That's a relatively new processor, so the extreme tuning utility will work. Performance maximizer will not. That is only for some of our later models, and those models are actually called out on our website. Let's see. I think we want to leave a few minutes before between our class and the ASUS discussion, so maybe we'll just do one or two more questions, and then we'll end here. Clint, did you see any that you were wanting to pick up on? Otherwise, I'll call one out.
You go for it. I joined the stream late.
No worries. Um, let's see. Storm. Oh, okay. Stealth was trying to help us out with the model number i7-8750H. Um, okay. Well, I think that we are at the end here. I don't see any others. Any of the moderators, do you have any questions that we missed? Feel free to let us know. Okay, I think we're gonna wrap it up here. I really want to say a big thank you to everybody who joined us today. Clint and I really enjoy this on the personal level. That's why we're here on a Saturday with you all. Thanks for showing an interest in overclocking. We would love to welcome new overclockers to the family. Um, you're welcome at any time. Feel free to reach out to any overclockers. They're usually more than happy to answer questions and help you be successful. Okay, have a nice day.
Thanks, guys.
Intel Gamer Days is coming soon. Be first to get great PC gaming deals and equip your battle rig with cutting-edge components. It all starts August 28th at gamerdays.intel.com.
We here at the county can provide resources, but somebody's got to actually take the next step and connect with the folks in need, and that's what Volunteers of America does. And we really can't effectively address and respond to the crises that we have unless we do it together.
It's that goodwill feeling in your heart that does it. Volunteers of America has been kind of the glue that keeps us together in our community.
Hey everybody, JJ here from Asus. I first just want to say thank you for everybody that is joining us on this Sunday. Hopefully everybody is safe, everybody's healthy, and you guys are ultimately, and guys and girls are ultimately enjoying your day. We've got some cool stuff to hopefully talk about in terms of overclocking, kind of extending on that great foundation that Intel laid in terms of giving us kind of that high level as well as some nice technical kind of deep dive into understanding some of the kind of the architecture and different aspects of how they really implemented overclocking. Overclocking is really kind of in the DNA for Asus, is really become, I'd say, being the industry leader when it comes to motherboard-based solutions. We are the world record holders in pretty much every single overclocking category. So it's something that is inherently within our design product. And I really, again, want to just thank Clint and Dan for the great foundation, for the information that they presented, and hopefully I'm going to help to kind of bring it home through a little bit of an Asus narrative, as well as providing some actual demonstrations. So we're going to be talking about a little bit of everything, and I'm also going to attempt to kind of circle back, check the actual Twitch chat, and see if you guys have questions, and I'll do my best to go ahead and jump into those as I can. A lot of what we're going to be talking about is going to be focusing on 10th gen and Z490, but I know that from my discussions with the LANFest team, there was definitely a lot of interest at understanding overclocking in general. So I think some of the foundational aspects that I'm going to be detailing are going to be applicable to those of you that might be running, 9th gen, 8th gen, 7th gen based processors. Although some of the demonstration aspects are going to really be highlighting a lot of the new technologies and feature set that we have for our latest generation of motherboards that complement the latest generation of Intel architecture and their 10th gen CPUs. But a lot of kind of the guidance and the insights and practices, they'll be applicable. So if you have older generational platforms, there will still be a continuity and a consistency to, I think, to kind of the different points that I'm talking about. So hopefully that'll help to kind of make sense. So I think first things first, let's go ahead and get into some of the kind of the basic nuts and bolts. I think to recap, if you missed, Intel's presentation, definitely go back and ultimately check that out. They laid a really good groundwork in terms of kind of what you do with overclocking, how are some of the different aspects approached when you go about which knobs are available. Knobs is kind of like this generic term that sometimes gets dropped a lot, but I think it's really important in terms of understanding, because part of the close work that Asus and then Intel do is really going to their performance labs, going and speaking with their R&D team, their architectural design team, to make sure that we have a clear understanding of their architectural features and then know how to translate those features into usable implementation. And many times this has allowed us to be first to market to introduce a lot of exciting technologies. Like we were the first to implement their VF curve functionality into our UEFI environments for 10th gen series processors, or adaptive voltage control, which I think is really almost the absolute best type of voltage control that isn't available really on any other platform in the industry when it comes to performance tuning. The work that we have fundamentally within the UEFI and what some people still call the BIOS unquestionably is literally the culmination of probably like a decade worth of consistent work working with Intel and their teams to keep kind of exposing more switches and knobs to really allow enthusiasts to have the most flexibility, whether you're kind of a novice user and you want to have something really turnkey, or you're really kind of dyed-in-the-wool enthusiast. And I'm going to try to go through some of those different kind of options. We'll go through our latest generation AIOC technology that we have on our Z490 series of motherboards, and then I'll also kind of be speaking to I think some more kind of basic manual-based tuning options that many kind of enthusiasts are going, hey, if I just want to go into the UEFI, how would I go about those options? So Before we get into that, I do want to kind of just touch on a couple of basic things. So before we get into kind of going over, the motherboards and going into the actual demos and going into all that, a couple of basic things that you want to keep in mind when you are actually going to be approaching overclocking. What do you fundamentally need, right? To recap, Intel noted that, of course, you need a K-series processor. So it's very easy when looking at any one of their processors. As long as it has that K designation, you know that it's an overclockable-based processor. So that means that you can essentially extend its performance attributes, right? You can increase those clock speeds. The second one is you're going to need some form of an overclocking centric motherboard on the chipset side, and so that is going to be anything that is going to be on the Z series chipset. Now there also are higher performing chipsets from Intel, such as the X series chipset like X299, that would also give you overclocking capabilities. But, also they talked about that their architecture and their processor designs are very robust and can provide a really high level of gaming performance out of the box, so sans any type of overclocking. And that's where, chipsets like their B and H series come out, and we make gaming motherboards for those lines as well. They don't support overclocking, but you can get great performance and great experience. But if you're going to want to approach overclocking, you need a K-series processor, and you're going to need a Z-series based chipset or an X-series chipset. What we're going to be focusing on though here is going to be Z-series chipset, which is kind of the mid-range enthusiast category. Beyond that, let's talk about a couple of other kind of key aspects. That's going to be one, is going to be the cooling solution. So here on my kind of little test bed setup right here, I've got a Noctua high performance tower heatsink. This is the U14S. It's a very good cooling solution, really helps to afford kind of a good headroom level in terms of being able to dissipate the additional heat. It's quiet, it's compact, allows me to kind of still have a lot of room there for memory, and it's not super expensive, and it will work within a lot of different types of builds. It's a very popular type of cooling solution. I'm a big fan of it. Now you can of course go up or you can go down. There's always the question mark, how much cooling solution you need, and that's always difficult to answer because it depends on what you're going for and what's the size of the system that you're trying to build. Is it something like, in the previous, Intel discussion, they talked about like a small form factor mini ITX system, or are you going to go in a big tower based solution? We've got all types of cooling solutions. This is an example of like, if you were really trying to go for something high end, this is a Strix LC 360 AIO. So this is about the highest end you would get to before you went to like a custom water cooling. So we make 120, 240, and 360. So pretty much in any type of cooling configuration situation, we're going to have you covered for whatever you're going to need. But it also is a little bit dependent, I think, on the CPU. So, this example right here is the box for the i9. The i9 with more cores comes more heat. And of course, the more that you drive those cores at higher frequencies, more heat's produced. So I'd probably say in most situations, as you go to like an i9 class, you're going to probably would be looking at like a 240 to 360. If you're in an i7 class CPU, you're probably going to be looking at 240 and 360, although high performance tower heat sinks I think would also fit in there. For i5s, you don't have to actually go into, I think even CLC. You could definitely go with a high performance tower based heatsink or 120 or 240 AIO cooling solution. But this is where I also do want to reinforce a great point that was touched on by Intel, is that temperature evaluation when you're stress testing has to be, I think, monitored in a sensible fashion. When you talk about temperatures under a extreme stress test, they're generally nowhere near the same temperatures that you're going to have when you're gaming or you're utilizing applications. In some situations, maybe if you're using your system for really demanding workloads, so you're doing professional content creation, so maybe you're doing like heavy rendering, you're doing science and simulation based workflows, you're doing specialized computational programs or things along those lines, then you would want to have a very high cooling solution, because your cores are going to be consistently under heavy load and they're going to produce more heat. But for gaming, I generally would tell you that it's not out of the norm to see sometimes a delta of 25 to 30 degrees delta, sometimes between, let's say, an extreme synthetic stress test and then your actual real world applications. So in that regard, you definitely want to keep in mind that while you want to kind of have that cooling solution make sense for not limiting your overclock, at the same time, the temperatures that you're accounting for should be representative of what you're really trying to target in terms of, is it gaming, or do you really kind of want to make sure that it's super cool even under these extreme synthetic stress tests, which are probably not going to be the way that you're really running your system, right? So that accounts for that. The next area is going to be, I think, the power supply. So right here, we've actually got our 750 watts, not a crazy big power supply. It's our Strix LC series power supply. We even have a higher end version. This one's an 80 plus gold. It's a fully modular based power supply. That's what we're going to be using for our 10600K that we have here on our Strix Z490-E motherboard. This is a really solid foundation. I think, usually my recommendation for most builds when you're going to be approaching overclocking is probably going to be somewhere in that range of, I'd say at least about a 650 watt would generally be my recommendation. It could be a little bit lower than that. I probably would never go below about a 550 watt because you want to make sure you have enough headroom for all the components that you have and essentially the additional wattage, because as you overclock a component, your power draw will go up. So let's say if your normal CPU, as in a general approximation, is consuming about 100 watts, it's not out of the norm. When you overclock it, they could literally double. It could go up to like 200 watts. So of course, if you build a whole system and that system is maybe, let's using 400, 400 would be quite a bit, but let's say it's using almost 400 watts, right? And you add another 100 watts and you only had like a 500 watt power supply, you've almost hit that wall, right? So that's where you always want to essentially make yourself to give enough headroom. So usually my recommendation for an overclocking based build is start off at around a 650 watt, and you can kind of move up from there. Again, we have multiple solutions to get you covered in that regard. And if you have more wattage, it's definitely not going to hurt you, but you don't necessarily, you don't need to be jumping to drop in and have like a 1,000 watt based power supply. It's just not something that's going to be required to be able to ensure that you have the headroom that you're looking for in terms of overclocking pursuit. Just double checking here to see if there's anybody that's popped in a question there. Doesn't look like it. That covers us in terms of the power supply. So I think the next item is going to be, before we get into some of the demonstration and some of the specifics, is going to be the motherboard. This is always an area that there's always so much discussion regarding, as far as what's the right motherboard, what's the best motherboard for overclocking. And to kind of give you just a high level perspective, Asus is really the de facto standard when it comes to overclocking. We right now, if we talk about current Intel based processors and even previous generations, we hold the #1 world record performance results. So right now 7.7 gigahertz on an Intel based processor, that's achieved on an Asus series motherboard for the 10900K. For the 9900K, it was also an Asus motherboard. For the 8086K, it was an Asus based motherboard. So we're very proud to consistently really be the benchmark in the industry for when we talk about the best experience possible. It's going to be Intel's best performing processors with our ROG series of motherboards. Now, does that mean that only our ROG series motherboards are going to be good for overclocking? No, we have a great lineup of different boards, whether it's our ProArt and WS series, or our Tough Gaming series, or our ROG and then ROG Strix series motherboards. We make many of them that can provide you a stable and reliable overclocking experience. So what are going to be some of the differences? This is where I want to spend a little bit of time to give a little bit of insight, is kind of what might be some quote-unquote differences between boards. So let's take a look here quickly before we get into the demo. This is probably going to take about maybe 5 or 10 minutes, but I think it is an important part to kind of cover. So if we take a look right here, we've got two great looking boards, and they're going to look pretty similar. One is our higher end motherboard. This is going to be the the Z490 Apex. So this is under our Maximus series. So this is the Maximus Apex, and this is the ROG Strix. The formal Maximus series is always our highest end series of motherboards. They feature the most advanced designs, the most specialized features, and the Apex is even kind of a specialized SKU within that lineup that is going to be offered the most overclocking centric based design. And then here we have our ROG Strix series, which is really designed kind of for that sweet spot gaming enthusiast that wants to be able to approach overclocking and have great features and functions, but doesn't necessarily need maybe extreme specialized features and functions that really kind of advanced users are looking for. Now, is there going to be a fundamental difference if I was to put in an i5, an i7, or an i9 in either one of these? Would fundamentally this board overclock higher than this board? For the vast majority of you, no. The experience is actually going to be the same. There are going to be subtle differences in terms of the design that would allow this board to maybe operate a little bit more efficiently, also provide some additional value to enthusiasts that want more nuanced level of controls. And there's also going to be some design differences. If we talk about something like the VRM, even if we went down below this and we went to like our entry level ROG Strix board, so like the Z490-A, it's still going to give you a great overclocking experience. It still has a very good heatsink design, still good, very power components. You're not going to necessarily be limited just because it has a little bit lower performing based operating parameters in terms of those components compared to the higher end board. So where's the difference? A good kind of comparison would be in something, let's say, like the cooling solutions. If you take a difference between like a 240 millimeter AIO and then like a 360 millimeter AIO, if you actually put them both on the processor, there's not going to be that much of a difference in the terms of the temperatures. They're both going to be able to provide very good temperatures. They're going to be pretty similar in terms of their acoustics, but one's going to be a little bit better, right? It's going to have a little bit better headroom. And that's very similar to kind of how it is on motherboards. They might both operate, so let's say if we want to dial in a 5 gigahertz overclock, both the boards would be able to operate 5 gigahertz overclock. But this one, because it has a higher performing heatsink, it has higher performing power components that are on here, might actually have this area operate more efficiently and at a lower operating temperature. That's a preference. As an enthusiast, I might just want my board to just be operating a little bit cooler, right? Or I might want it to be operating a little bit more efficiently. But it's not fundamentally that this board isn't going to allow for that experience. This also plays into DRAM. So when you talk about different DRAM kits, so an example might be something like this. This is a T-Force Excalibur DDR4000, so it's a very high frequency kit of memory. Both the boards will entirely run this. But the Apex has been specialized for super high DRAM overclocking, so it's only got a 2-DIMM design, so it's going to allow for even maybe a little bit higher frequency. That might be possible, let's say, in a 4-DIMM configuration, but we'll talk a little bit more about that in a little bit as far as kind of the difficulty levels of when you approach overclocking and how that might play into different parameters. So again, not a huge difference in terms of fundamentally saying, hey, if I go with an ROG Strix board versus, let's say, a Maximus series motherboard, that I'm going to have an unquestionably higher level of performance. It's going to be that there are more specialized features, functions, and designs that are on here that complement, advanced overclocking enthusiasts. The one thing I will say on the Asus side, though, is that our ROG series motherboards always feature our best-in-class, let's say, overclocking options. So the exact demo that I'm going to show you, our AI overclocking technology, it's only on, let's say, like our ROG series motherboards and not like on our tough gaming series motherboards that we're going to offer. So if you really like this type of advanced overclocking feature that really helps to simplify things so that you don't have to worry about understanding many of the kind of subtleties to overclocking, you can pick up one of these boards, go in there, turn the option on, and it's going to pretty much take care of the entire process for you safely and effectively. So that gives you a little bit of difference in terms of, mid-range series boards to high-end series boards. And lastly, I'll kind of go here and just kind of look a little bit more quickly and explain some of these key points that sometimes are discussed when you talk about motherboards and kind of how they play into overclocking. So let me go ahead and just set this up here so we can get a little bit closer and we can take a look here. And I can give you a little bit of insight in terms of how that plays out. So we're going to go ahead and switch over here. So if we take a look here at the board, this is the section right here. These are your power components. So here you have your capacitors. Right underneath these large heat sinks are the power components. You have two primary power components that are going to be there, what they're referred to as called power stages on a higher end series motherboard, as opposed to what's referred to as a MOSFET or a driver. Those power stages, and then these large what are called inductors or chokes. Those components essentially make up the power phases on a motherboard. And a lot of times in communities, this will get a lot of discussion. There will be people that essentially will be talking about the power components, and the power components are the most important part. Power components are definitely important, but they're not actually the end-all be-all. And the reason being is because if you don't have good quality PCB design, if you don't have good quality trace layout design, the trace layout is going to be essentially these traces. So these are signaling paths that essentially connect all the key areas to each other across the board, and they carry signaling. And then there's also the UEFI, the firmware, what some people still refer to as the BIOS. That is critical because the firmware is what helps to actually execute the management and the operation of all these components together. If you do not have good quality firmware, it doesn't matter if you have the absolute best components possible, the firmware, if it's poorly tuned and it's not correctly optimized to benefit the architecture of the design, you're not going to get a great experience. You're going to have inconsistent restarts. You're not going to be able to have smooth, effective balancing when it comes to how you dial in voltages or calibration of voltages or many other parameters. And this is really where ASUS, I think, is a leader in this category, is that when you take a look at the harmonious level of design, right, you do not want to limit your design narrative or your perspective to just the component. It is the balance of the thermal solution, so the VRM design, as far as the cooling solution like the heatsink, then the actual power componentry, the PCB, the traces, and critically the firmware. Any one of those that is not done correctly will limit the other from optimally being able to reach its best results. You know, like if you had like a comparison to this, imagine like a high performance car. It's not just about the transmission. It's not just about the brakes. It's not just about the tires. It's not just about the, you know, the motor that it might have. It's also about the actual, you know, the ECU and the drive logic that they built in that handles, you know, gear shifting and so many other attributes. All those have to work together. If you had the most amazing brakes and the best transmission, but, you know, a poorly tuned motor or incorrect balance in terms of the car, in terms of its weight, many other aspects, car wouldn't drive that well. It wouldn't feel good, right? You really have to make sure to balance all those things. And this is something that gets overlooked sometimes, not only amongst kind of reviews that you'll see out there, but also sometimes general conversation in the community. So it is important to be aware of the componentry, and we do message that. Like on our product pages, you'll see, hey, it has this type of power design. That's important, but make sure to keep in mind the entirety of the design. And this is where generation after generation, why I mentioned we've been leaders in the overclocking segment, is our designs that show our commitment to making sure that we're providing you designs as a whole that provide a great experience. So again, don't just look at just that power component or just this heatsink, right? It's a combination of all these different aspects that you're going to have on the motherboard. So hopefully that gives you a little bit better perspective there. Give me a moment here. I'm going to switch back over into the Twitch chat, just see if we have anything that might have popped up, and we'll kind of go from there. So let me see. Doesn't look like we have any questions as of yet. So great. So we're just going to keep kind of moving things along here. So I think the next item that I want to talk a little bit about is going to be, I think, levels to overclocking and how you approach your overall overclocking experience. So there was a lot of discussion regarding kind of the CPU and then also DRAM. But before we get into this, one important thing to keep in mind is that there are different levels to how you approach overclocking. So the easiest, I'd say, pursuit of overclocking will be just a traditional increase to the CPU frequency. Or just an increase to the DRAM frequency. So if we talk about the CPU being absolute stock, so you're not modifying the DRAM, the speed of the DRAM, the RAM itself, or the CPU frequency, that is the easiest. That is essentially 100% stock. Whatever the memory vendor has rated that memory for and whatever Intel has rated their CPU for, it's going to run at those speeds. It's going to ensure stable and reliable operation. Pretty much, you don't even need an overclocking part, right? There's no point almost to buy a K part or overclocked memory for that purpose, or a Z-series motherboard, but that's the baseline, okay? The next step up is going to be, I would say, stock CPU with an XMP on memory. An example of this might be if I take this memory right here, and actually, let's see if I can show this to you in the UEFI, and maybe make this a little bit easier for you guys to understand visually if we go into the UEFI. So give me a moment here. We're going to switch over into our system. That should be, that's our desktop. Okay, it's a little bit of latency here, so give me a second here. I'm going to have to reboot, and we're going to go into our UEFI. Okay, all right, there we got a picture-in-picture mode. And so when you talk about, again, the scale, right? So you have that baseline of stock, then you have stock and XMP. So XMP, there are different speeds. An example, again, here with this stick of memory, this is a 4,000 stick of memory, so it's a pretty high rated. Many, I'd say, builders, when you're kind of building your system, you're probably going to be looking at something a little bit more conservative, maybe something like, you know, 3,000, 32, 3,600 megahertz, something around there in terms of that speed. Okay, when you install this memory, it doesn't run at the XMP speed. That's a special profile that has been validated by the memory manufacturer and also by Intel's XMP labs. And when you install this memory module, it actually will work at a default operating value that is referred to as the SPD speed. Right now, you can see we're in our UEFI, and if you take a look at the BIOS, what people called the BIOS, but it's actually not the BIOS anymore. It is called the UEFI. That is what it is now, but we still use that kind of term because it's been so popular. But you can see the DRAM frequency is actually 2400 megahertz. It's nowhere near that 4000 megahertz that this module has actually been rated for. So if you run your CPU at its standard frequency and then bump this up to the XMP speed, so I'm going to go over into XMP. You'll see right here that there's an option that if I go to the AI Overclock Tuner, you'll see that there's an XMP parameter. I can go ahead and select XMP, and that's it. That's all I need to do to actually select XMP. It's very, very simple. You can see now that it will actually load this speed, and upon rebooting, it will run at the speed. So I can do that. It's even simpler in actually our easy mode interface. If you don't even go into our advanced mode, if I actually was to go to our easy mode screen, this is our easy mode screen. You can actually see that there's a nice little button right there that even says XMP, and by default, it actually would have been enabled. All Asus motherboards feature this technology. You can just click that button, bam, that's it. That's all you need to do. It will automatically enable the XMP, so I can save that, and I'm good to go. So it's very, very simple process in terms of allowing you essentially that flexibility. So that's level 2, right? Stock operation, DRAM running at SPD. Next level would be stock operation and then running the XMP for my memory. The third level would then be taking that essentially that stock CPU frequency and running an overclock frequency for the CPU, but keeping the memory at essentially the SPD value, right? So it's essentially similar to that second level, but you've just essentially changed up, instead of changing the DRAM, you're changing the CPU. Now, why is that important to keep in mind? Anytime you push some type of performance attribute, you have to account for that it's going to affect essentially the possibility of that other attribute. Kind of think about it almost in a way that if I was to lift a weight on one arm, it's probably a little bit easier than if I tried to lift weights on both arms simultaneously, because I'm exerting more overall effort from my body as a whole. So if I ask essentially the processor, where there's a special function, this special part of the actual CPU that is called the memory controller, it's built into the CPU, you're asking the memory controller to run at a higher speed. So you're actually running that memory controller, you're asking it to run at a higher speed than it is default set to operate at. This is just like if you were to ask the CPU to run at a faster frequency. So instead of 4.6 gigahertz, I'm asking it to run at 5 gigahertz. Well, if I ask it to run at 5 gigahertz and I'm asking the memory to run at 4 gigahertz, that's a lot more demanding than if I was asking it to run at 5 gigahertz for the CPU, but then asking it to run, at a lower frequency for the DRAM. So it's more challenging for your CPU to essentially be running an overclocked CPU and then also overclocked DRAM. Now, but it doesn't stop there. There's even kind of a higher level of difficulty. One of the kind of architectural design benefits and one of those knobs that Intel talked about is something called that cache. That cache is part of their ring bus technology. Essentially, it's a communication path, and Intel gives you the ability to modify that communication path. You can tune it so that you can get potentially better performance from your system as a whole. It's subtle, but it's cool that you have access to essentially being able to tweak that and be able to get more performance out of your system. But that is going to be more difficult. So again, if I'm now going to be overclocking my CPU, I'm going to overclock my memory, but now I also overclock my cache. That is one of the most complex types of overclocking kind of pursuits that can occur. You running all three of those at the same time. And then last but not least, to kind of add another little layer into that, is that you have the consideration of what some people in the community call kind of the silicon lottery. Every CPU is going to be different, and that means that some will be able to overclock to a little bit more, some will overclock a little bit less, and they are affected by other attributes like the quality of the motherboard, the quality of the firmware, the cooling solution, even the temperatures. You'll sometimes find that even if you can run chips a little bit cooler, even if you haven't reached a point where they might throttle, you might get a little bit better likelihood that the CPU might reach a little bit higher frequencies. So sometimes keeping it a little bit cooler than even essentially it's underneath, let's say, a worrisome point. Like many people in the community say, oh, always I want my CPU to be under 80 degrees. It's not a bad value to target in terms of that value. It's not necessarily really one you have to consistently target. The CPU could totally be hitting, you know, peak points of 90 degrees, and it's entirely okay because that's before it would get to a throttle point. But what you'll find as you start to aggressively overclock is that you might be able to sustain overall better stability if that CPU is staying a bit colder overall. So if it's staying consistently, let's say in, you know, mid 70s, just getting to 80 as opposed to kind of breaching 90, 91, 92, even though that's below what's called a throttle point in terms of the actual temperature, it might hold better stability. And so that's where having kind of higher performing cooling can be beneficial. That's why some users also go into the water cooling world, because in water cooling, it really kind of allows for that next level of temperature performance. So just something to keep in mind in that regard. So that overall, I think, gives some perspective in terms of some of the different things to kind of keep in mind. So now I think what I want to talk about is we talked about kind of the main items that you're going to need for pursuing your overclocking, some of the differences in terms of board design consideration, right? The cooling considerations, difficulty levels that you're going to have to account for when you pursue overclocking. And I think one of the last ones are just what are some kind of things that you want to have when you get ready to start overclocking, as we're going to get ready to go into our demo here and show you some AIOC, as well as how you actually can go through the manual tuning process. For me, when I get ready to overclock, there's a couple of things I always want to keep on hand. One, for some reason I get thirsty, so I always like to have a little bit of water or a refreshing beverage. Some tea is always good too. That's one. Two is, if I pull it over here, I have it here to the side. There's going to be actually a pad of some type, and then a pen or a pencil or something to write with. This is not a requirement, but I will many times find that as you're kind of switching through different values, it's really useful to sometimes write things down, double check if you have things. You could, of course, be saving text files and screenshots and things like that when you're doing things in Windows when you're stress testing, but because you might run into a crash or something might happen, it can be useful to sometimes just have something that you can write and you can kind of go back and forth to quickly confirm you know, what was the last value you checked or what is kind of a value that you're trying to go for, something like that. To go along with that is going to be a flash drive. So this is just a standard flash drive right here, and our UEFI has a really cool function that's called print screen, where it's just like print screen in Windows. You can hit a button, the F12 key, and you can save screenshots. And so not only does our UEFI allow you to save profiles, so once you get to an overclock, if you really wanted to save that profile, you could save it. But sometimes if you just want to maybe screen capture something so that you can later share it in the community, like our PCDIY Facebook group, we have a really good group that we recently started where you could ask people insights. Instead of typing a whole bunch of things out and maybe not correctly communicating values that you've set, you can be like, hey, these are the values that I've changed, and you can share the screenshot. It makes overclocking discussions so much easier because you can't share a profile, but you can share a screenshot. So that is really beneficial in that regard. So having a flash drive can be useful in that regard. The last item I will say is that you want to kind of make sure that you're doing is, it's not always required, but ideally I would recommend, if you haven't pursued overclocking, generally check for the latest UEFI firmware. So the UEFI firmware is essentially kind of the operating system for the motherboard. It dictates a huge amount of how the motherboard works in terms of overclocking pursuits. We consistently tune it to maximize performance, improve interoperability and compatibility, maybe implement new options, and especially for some of our features like AIOC, it even introduces refinements and further enhancements. So you want to make sure that you're running that newer firmware. You can do that very easily. We actually have a video on our Asus North American YouTube channel where I walk you through the entire process about how to flash and update your UEFI. So if you want to know how to do that and you've never done it before, check out that video. It will pretty much be applicable to, I'd say, probably about the last 3-4 years of any motherboard that we have on the market on the process of how to essentially update it. So very straightforward. So those are pretty much all the things you need to know. So now let's actually jump into the UEFI. Okay. So we're going to switch over. Actually, we're going to switch over into the desktop environment, and we're going to go through some basic parameters here. So I'll go through some of the applications you want, and then we'll go through actually how to go through some of the base OC aspects. Okay. So right now I'm just rebooting the operating system, and I'm going to go into the UEFI. If you've never done this before, pretty much all you're doing is just restarting the operating system. You're going to hit the delete key on your keyboard, and that's going to allow you to get into the UEFI environment, and that's so that we can essentially access these low-level settings to be able to make adjustments. Now, if you've never done any overclocking, your motherboard by default generally is going to be operating at what is usually kind of referred to as stock values. These are the general advocated, communicated, excuse me, not the advocated, but the communicated operating specifications for your memory or for your processor, okay? I'm just gonna load UEFI defaults. That means just the board, I'm asking it to run essentially at its basic values. No overclocking is gonna be applied to it. I'm now going to head over into the AI Tweaker section. The AI Tweaker section is essentially what allows me to make any type of overclocking adjustments that we would have applied to the motherboard. So it's pretty straightforward. You'll see at the very top right here of the screen, there's going to be essentially what I would have referred to as our predictive values. So this is essentially the motherboard is letting you know, hey, these are the values that I'm going to attempt to dial in, and they will adjust in real time. To the right-hand side, and this is pretty much going to be consistent for Asus motherboards, you're going to see things like the expected frequency, the real-time temperature, voltage, the ratio, and DRAM voltage, DRAM frequency, and then also the density of the memory that you have installed. So I've got 16 gigabytes, so it's letting me know that all that. The newer function that we have right here, which is really cool, is our AIOC technology. So this is something that we literally spent, thousands of man hours on in terms of design and development, in terms of a special predictive model that is based off of actually extensive testing and analysis, where we literally took thousands of CPUs, we took hundreds of cooling permutations, and we actually checked all the corresponding values that we needed by stress testing all those. We essentially did manual overclocking to an ultra large range of CPU samples with different types of cooling solutions so that we would have essentially a predictive level of information already internally on the motherboard. This is why we call it AI-based, because we've essentially created a machine learning model, and that machine learning model, it will work once we actually install, and once you install the CPU on your system and you enable the AIOC, what it will actually do is it will track the temperature and then align that with the CPU part that we have. It knows the CPU that you have. It can see the actual temperature performance that you have of your cooler, and it goes, at this corresponding temperature, you should be able to target this frequency. And then we also know, hey, these are the voltages that were generally needed after testing many different CPUs. Now, there's sometimes this mythos of like, don't ever trust automated overclocking because it's going to provide you more. I can unquestionably tell you that is not accurate for our AIOC technology. It has very much been weighted to be efficient and effective in terms of the amount of voltage that it's providing. The important thing to keep in mind is that there might always be a little bit of variance, that if you were to manually tune it, you might actually find that you couldn't manually tune it less, because you are going to be in the range that the voltage that we're going to supply is required to be able to hit stability. Maybe you have a little bit better CPU, so you could get away with a little bit less. But you have to account for, you are only one sample. We've literally tested thousands of CPUs, and we keep testing more. So we then look at that library, and we've generally found as a whole, we need to be providing this level of voltage to really actually ensure stability and consistency for the widest set of users that use this function. And the great thing is here is that you can use this information right off the bat. Instead of having to spend hours watching videos online, looking in forums, asking for recommendations, you can actually see right there, there's already a prediction table that is communicated to you, that it will actually let you know, hey, this is the frequency that we think you can target. We account for what's called AVX and non-AVX. So while most games won't utilize AVX, you're starting to see some applications use it. Windows uses it lightly. Generally though, for most overclocking pursuits, you generally do not need to worry about AVX, and you can push up the frequency a little bit more. But if you want to have both, we tell you, hey, this is the voltage level that you would need to be able to reach either one of these. And keep in mind, you don't even need to worry about this. You could just go in, and I could just go to this, I could just go into the options for letting AI optimization take place, and it will actually take care of everything for me, and it will just begin to use the predictive values. To do that, it's very simple, and actually I'll kind of show you the way that it works. But The great thing is that we essentially are using this ultra large amount of data that we've compiled internally to make all these values. But if you're a manual tuner and you still want to do it yourself, you can use the approximate values that we're giving you right here, and then you could dial those in, and either you could go a little bit up or you could go a little bit less. It's entirely up to you. So it's a very, very flexible system that you can use however you want, whether you want to go for more kind of that manual approach or you want to go for a more easy kind of turnkey experience where, hey, I can just enable these options. So if I was going to go really manual, I would switch the board into manual mode, and pretty much all you would need to do is head down here to core ratio, and you're going to have pretty much two options. One is going to be the sync all core usage, and the other one's going to be by core usage. Sync all core, it would mean that essentially if I have something like a part like this where I've got up to 12 threads, right, 6 core, 12 thread part, it means everything's going to be running at one speed. I'm going to try to have everything run. So an example might be if I wanted everything to run at 4.8, that would be like a good target, because here this CPU part, the max performance it can offer on one core would be 4.8, but it can't do 4.8 at all by the default. But I could ask essentially the CPU, hey, I want you to run at all 4.8. So that would give me at least ensure better performance than what Intel is offering out of the box, because I'm matching at least the same max single core speed, but now I'm introducing that across all, right? So that gives me an uplift in performance. If I wanted even more though, I would need to go above that. Now this is where some people kind of mess up, I think, at not fully taking advantage of Intel's architecture. Intel really allows for robust options where you can kind of fine tune frequency. In the same way that I talked about the analogy of kind of lifting weights, right? You tend to have a predominant arm or more strength in kind of one arm than another. So if you're right-handed, you probably can lift more weight on your right arm, right hand, than you can on your left arm, left hand, right? And in that situation, it's very similar to per core. You might have some cores that might be able to go to a little bit higher frequency. So maybe 1 or 2 cores that might be able to go to 50, 51, 52, right? But not all the cores could hit 52. You also have to count for thermals. There might be way more heat that you could handle, and all of them being 52. So in that scenario, you could go in and you could dial in. So let's say I want 1, right, to be, 52, right, 2, 51, and then 3 through then 6, 48, whatever. It could be, what you generally would want to target in terms of the corresponding values. And again, the cool thing is if you did it with AIOC would take care of all these values for you. And the really important part is that AIOC does things efficiently and effectively in alignment with Intel's latest architecture. So we do it through per core to maximize the best headroom. So if you're an old school overclocker but haven't really been paying attention to new types of technology and features, and you think like, oh, I don't really know how to do it through that, we've done that work for you. You don't have to worry about it. So it's quite beneficial in that regard of taking the most effective and efficient ways to overclock and already having them being applied. So that is an advantage. So if I again go back to manual, outside of that, what else might I need to adjust? There would probably be the voltage consideration. Here's that cache ratio. Remember when I talked about, though, if you increase the cache ratio is generally going to sometimes limit. If I want to drive that to the same value as the CPU frequency, you could limit that. So a lot of times the motherboard, it has something that's called an auto rule. We've already kind of set the cache ratio to an optimal level where we know it usually will not limit the overclocking headroom for the CPU frequency. So you generally do not want to touch the cache ratio. Although for performance tuners, they want to get a little bit more performance, you can of course try to bump that value up, right? Now in terms of the voltage, again here, some overclockers are going to pick a manual or static vid. It's the most inefficient way to overclock a system because you're going to force the voltage to stay consistent pretty much at that 1 voltage level. The ideal standard is what Intel has with adaptive, which allows us to just essentially increase the voltage range for the higher frequency that exists beyond the kind of the max normal frequency. So if my max normal frequency is 4.8 and I'm dialing up to, let's say, like 5.1, what I'm modifying in terms of that voltage is going to be going up from there. And that's really amazing because this, before this came out, you really weren't dealing with the same type of efficiency. And this is fantastic because it helps to extend the lifespan of the part. Even when you're overclocking, it helps to produce better temperature performance and helps to reduce many other aspects. So it's really the absolute best option that you have available to you when you overclock. And again, this is how we use voltage when we do AIOC. So that is what you would essentially want to go ahead and set. So let me pretty much just show you what it would look like if we went about trying to do things. So I want to give a comparison right here to what the system would look like if we went through a full manual setup. So I'm going to tell the motherboard run essentially enforce all limits. I want it to essentially run pure 100% Intel stock. So let's look at what the performance level would be for that. And then we're going to go back and run kind of a test AIOC setup, and we'll see how kind of that goes. And while we're going through that, we'll take a look at your guys' questions. So let me go ahead and save that. So this is 100% pretty much stock value. What we're going to do is check the corresponding frequency, right, under load. We'll run a quick benchmark. I'll show you some of the applications that you're going to want to use, and we'll then go from there. So let me circle back while that is rebooting there into the desktop. It's going to do very quick because I have an SSD, and I'm going to quickly just check and see if we got any questions there that have kind of popped up. So we got a question here, is why do ASUS boards seem to be better than most other companies? I, of course, going to be biased. I don't think it's that seem to be better. We definitely are. There's a reason why we have literally been the #1 motherboard manufacturer in the world globally, I think now for more than 15 years. That is exceedingly difficult, excuse me, to be able to maintain that level of position of leadership without, I think, offering boards that consistently show better performance, more innovation. Unquestionably on the innovation, if there's probably a key feature on motherboards that has been designed in the last decade, it was on an ASUS motherboard before any other manufacturer. Isolated audio design, we were the first to implement. We were the first to implement an AIOC predictive technology, an integrated IO shield. We were the first one to implement even RGB. While that doesn't affect performance, although, hey, right, all of us love RGB on our motherboards. All these things were first done on ASUS. So again, that VF curve, while that was something that Intel built into their architecture, we were the first ones to phase into our UEFI. Many other aspects, we were the first to introduce, especially on the ROG side, and I think it comes from our extensive R&D commitment. An interesting kind of piece that you might wonder about is, we have about 16,000 employees, and over 5,000 of those employees are R&D, and so that allows us to have a huge amount of focus and effort at really being kind of at the forefront of trying to push the envelope in terms of so many categories. So we're going to get into the desktop here, so let me switch back over into the desktop. Okay, so I'm in the desktop, and these are my general applications that I recommend. One is going to be a very free one, an easy one. That's going to be ASUS AI Suite. This is a utility that comes with any single one of our motherboards, so it's free, it's no cost to you. HW Info is a fantastic application that you can use for additional monitoring. Many of the values that are there are going to be in AI Suite, but many users like HW Info, and we do work with actually them from a development standpoint. So it is updated consistently, which is very important. You want to have it be updated for chipsets, for motherboards. There's specialized controllers that are on the motherboards, many other aspects. Ada64 is an outstanding application, one of my absolute favorites out there, and we work consistently with Ada to provide them information on our design so that they have correct monitoring values. They also work closely with Intel. Very important. You do have to pay for it, but it's absolutely one of the best applications to pay for. Cinebench is a great application for kind of stress testing, but also providing you a score. I really am a big fan of our ROG Real Bench. This is an application that we offer 100% for free. It's a full system stress test and benchmark utility. The great thing is that we utilized open source applications, so everything from GIMP to Handbrake. They're all built in here, and so they will stress test your system very heavily, but also give you a score. And so it's a really good way to be able to check your system at stock, and then again at an overclock setting, and actually see what are performance values that I have, but also heavily stress testing your system. Some applications can stress test the system really well, but they might not heavily utilize memory. They might not swap files back and forth. They might not talk to the GPU. And when you overclock, you will be surprised at sometimes how it introduces different characteristics to a system. So we try to really implement more of something that would be kind of closer to like PC Mark, and that it really tests multiple parts of the entirety of the system to ensure that there's stability and reliability at how it's working. Geekbench is another really great application. It's consistently updated for new instruction sets. Does a really good job of stress testing a number of different type of usage scenarios, including things like browsing and many other aspects It is a paid-for application, but you can get a trial to allow you to at least run initial tests. The Intel XTU software that the Intel team talked about, we make sure that it works on our boards, and it's very well designed, has a lot of monitoring functionality, very clean and easy to read, very, very good application choice, and you can always download that also directly on our support website. So you can go to any support website for ASUS for your motherboard, and you'll also have an option there to download the XTU software. And lastly, I think would also be OCCT, which was also recommended before. So let's go ahead and open up Ada, and we're going to essentially check performance. So we're going to essentially open up the CPU here, and I'm just going to open up Task Manager for reference, and there we go. And so now we're essentially going to load this up. We're just going to go to its integrated stress test. Now I have, for just purposes of here, it's not really going to make that much of a difference for what we're trying to demonstrate here, but I have disabled AVX just for transparency. So AVX is turned off here. But I can show you, actually, if I turn it back on, how much of a temperature difference it will make. This graph might be a little bit hard for you guys to read, so I'll switch it here into just general statistics. And you can pretty much see right here that our overall peak, our peak frequency, right, is about 4.5 gigahertz on all cores, right? This is not the peak, right, because this processor can actually support up to a peak on one single core, up to 4.8, right? So this is at stock. So now we're going to essentially go ahead and execute AIOC and see how AIOC is going to be able to apply things intelligently to be able to get more out of our system. And we'll show you essentially how it works. It's super, super, super easy. Very, very easy to work with. But what I would normally recommend is for you to stress test your system when you're first setting it up to make sure everything's stable and reliable, and run an actual benchmark. So if I stop that, you could do a full benchmark in Ada. Ada has a really good system benchmark that's actually also good for stress testing as well. So let me stop this right here. I've got two mice here, so it's a little bit tricky. If I go ahead and open up RLG RealBench, it would be really easy to run this benchmark. So essentially I would just click start and run it, and I'll show you kind of what this looks like here. I think this was the first one I might have ran, but you'll essentially get this dump right here, and you'll have a score. So that score, you essentially would want to save that score and then compare that to your overclock base score, right? So this will actually run pretty quickly, but I'm not going to worry about that right now. I'm just going to go into AIOC and show you what to do that. Now we're not going to enable XMP as of yet. We're just going to essentially go from the baseline value. Head back over here into the UEFI. Okay, so now we're back in the UEFI, and I'm just going to check if there's any questions. And so somebody had a question, would this work on another competitor's motherboard? It would actually not. The feature that I'm running through, everything else that I've showed you would be true. It would actually be applicable. I've tried to be balanced, I think, in that regard, but this specific functionality is exclusive to ASUS motherboards. But the previous kind of manual parameters that I did discuss in detail are fundamentally true on any motherboard that supports an Intel-based processor. So at that point, we're going to head over to AI Tweaker. And all essentially we need to do is we're going to just load back the defaults. So load defaults right here. And then from there, I'm going to keep it at auto, so it let the BIOS essentially optimize, right? And I'm going to head over to AI Optimize, or I can also go to that little item there at the top. It says AIOC Guide. That's also an option right there. Okay, so that's going to be F11. And it actually gives you a lot of really great information. You can actually see right there, it pretty much shows me everything I need to know if I wanted to find out more about how everything works. We break everything down to you and do all this. And so we're just essentially saying, hey, we want to enable AIOC, and we're going to do that. And you can already see that it's helped to actually provide us some values in terms of the frequency target, the corresponding voltages. It's set an AVX offset for us. This has all been done. And you could kind of customize this if you wanted to. If you wanted to be a little bit more where you wanted the AVX offset to be more aggressive, you could say, hey, I want to account for a heavy AVX offset consideration, so that it'll even help to reduce that a little bit more. You can see that what it's saying there is that if it detects an AVX load, even though we're targeting a 5 gigahertz overclock, it's going to drop that down to 4.8 when it senses that, to ensure stability and reliability. The really cool thing about AIOC though is if we actually go down here to AI features, it's going to do a couple of things. One, it'll let us know some information like it's going to do the 50 on 3 cores, 49 on 5 cores, and then 48 on all cores. So it's doing that full per core based overclocking target. And then this other aspect is very important right here, cooler efficiency customization. So I don't need to do this because we've already reset it, but I'm just going to reset it there, the cooler calibration. And the reason why is because it's actually going to detect the cooler's performance, and it will adjust the actual overclock frequency in real time. This is important because maybe you're overclocking, maybe let's say the pump fails or something isn't working as reliably, or your ambient temperature goes up a lot during the summer, right? As opposed to, let's say, in the winter, your actually overclock could go down because it's essentially going, hey, you're getting warmer than it used to be and your cooling performance isn't as high. That's where you have these points. These points are essentially adapted based on your cooling score. So all you essentially need to do when you enable this is, by default, you would just go into Windows and run your games or run a general benchmark. Once you run the benchmark, if you were to run this at stock but enable the AIOC, it will track the actual performance. And then from there, it will essentially make that adjustment to the frequency. So we're going to go with that, and we're going to be good to go. Okay, so we're going to save that. We're going to let it reboot. And I'm going to let it boot back up into Windows, but I'm going to check back over and just see while we get back into Windows if there's any other questions right there. Looks like no questions as of yet, so everything's looking fine, no problem. Great. Okay. So it's going to essentially reboot back into Windows. And from there, we're essentially going to run your tests. Now, as far as your tests, what would you want to run to essentially calibrate the cooler in terms of AIOC? Entirely up to you. My recommendation is actually ROG Real Bench. Download it because it's free. You could run it to run the stress test for like 15 or 30 minutes. That will put a good amount of heat load on there, really stress test the CPU, and give you a good representation of balance for the actual program to build off kind of that model of what should be kind of the target frequency that it should be shooting for. But if you wanted to use Prime 95, or if you wanted to use AIDA64 stress test, or if you just wanted to use games, then you could use games. You should use whatever you feel will really be kind of the most kind of consistent usage scenario that you have on your system. I always recommend actual games, but you know, if you want to do this kind of right off the bat, then use something like ROG Real Bench for those testing purposes, right? Okay. So from there, go ahead and let it open up. It's going to take a moment to gather system information. Now it's gone ahead and gathered the system information. And here, we're going to go ahead and now let it run its benchmark. So the benchmark, actually, I shouldn't even touch it, because if it senses that there's an actual if there senses that there's an actual change, moving the mouse, it'll actually disable the actual benchmark in itself. But that will essentially calibrate the cooler, right? And like I said, this will go through the corresponding settings. So we'll let it go ahead and kind of run through its course. But you can see all the cool kind of things that is happening in terms of real time, in terms of the benchmark. So I'm just going to go back and see while this is running if any of you have any questions right here that kind of come up. So I'd say the benchmark is pretty quick. It depends on kind of your system. If you're doing it on a modern system, sometimes it only takes probably a few minutes. It's generally less than about 5 minutes. The default general for the ROG Real Bench stress test would be 15 minutes, but you can go much higher, where you can go to like 30 minutes, you can go an hour, you can go multiple hours, and of course if you're using other tests, you can go for a much longer period of times. The most important thing generally is you want to hit like a certain target to what's called kind of like heat soaking. Essentially, you want to hit a point to where generally the heat won't rise anymore because the part essentially have reached its maximum level of heat output. And what you'll generally find in most situations is that the previous recommendation by Intel's team about 30 minutes, I would entirely agree with it. That's a really good kind of target. If you can generally run whatever you're going to run for about that value, it's going to be very representative of generally hitting kind of the maximum wall of what you would reach from a thermal standpoint in whatever application you're going to be running. In some situations, it could even be less than that. Depends entirely on the program. As far as how much longer you run it, let's say over 30 minutes, that's entirely really up to you. I agree though with the logic that Intel provided in terms of that, you know, really going over 30 minutes, it's not required. If you feel more comfortable in an hour or 2 hours, then definitely go for it. Personally, generally for me, like I said, I think with our AIOC technology, I generally now usually only target about a 30-minute to an hour, and after that, I'm entirely fine, because from there it's going to provide me the predictive essentially adjustment, and then it just makes adjustments dynamically. Like I said, if the cooling score went down, then it would adjust. Now, some people might wonder, well, what happens if it gets a little bit more aggressive? And in the past, actually, in our first generation, we did have that, where it sometimes you might go back and raise up your overclock a little bit more. Now, it's not going to keep going up and up and up, because your cooling performance is not going to go like all of a sudden it would go from being able to have you know, be at the performance level of, let's say, like a 240, and then all of a sudden it's going to be at custom water cooling level. It can't go up that range, because your temperature would detect essentially it's not just that much of an increase, but it might bump up maybe by like what Intel referred to as a band. So that might be something like 100 megahertz. But in our latest generation, we actually give you that option, that essentially upon one of the subsequent reboots, it will actually provide you a little option that says, would you like to stop training? So that means that if you're happy with your overclock at that point, it will no longer consistently be referencing essentially new information on the cooling score, and it will stop it. So you don't, essentially, it won't change that frequency anymore. It will stay at that value that's been defined. So it makes it very easy in terms of that regard. So we're almost wrapping things up here. But we're just going to check here. See, doesn't look like we have any questions yet in that regard, so looking good there. So I'm just going to check here on our system, and we're going to go from there. So you can see we're almost wrapped up in terms of our bench. And you can actually see that the score is there on the left-hand side. It's right now actually going through a heavy kind of multitasking test. It's gone through actually one of the most hard parts. So there's the image manipulation test, which does a lot of kind of single-threaded based workloads and a little bit more kind of lightly threaded based workloads. And then the encoding is super heavy to multiple threads. It's, if you're familiar with an application called Handbrake, it essentially is utilizing all those cores heavily. And you can see it's actually output our final score right there. So we have now a completed score, and that's quite a bit higher than what we had previously. So it really helps to extend the overall performance. And we can actually go through right here. I didn't leave up the system score. So, but we'll do that quickly here. If I do this, do that. Give me a moment here and open up these kind of corresponding applications. All right, but you can see it actually passed everything in terms of our actual benchmark. So again, if we were to maybe do something like Cinebench, we could take a look right here. We can open up Cinebench. And we won't go through single core right now, because that would take definitely a while, even though we've overclocked it pretty heavily. But if we start running that, this is again placing this load onto our system, right? And of course you can track your frequencies, right? And you can already see there's kind of like the all core frequencies that you have there in terms of what they're registering. So 4.7 across all that. So that's already higher than the previous one that we had, right? You remember before it was only at 4.5, right? Now, of course, if you had single threaded workloads, it'd even be higher. So of course here, if we go for just kind of comparison, and again, remember if we take a look at some of those kind of numbers, I'm opening things while the system is benchmarking. So it's going to take there a moment to kind of run through everything right there. So we'll give it a moment. Actually, let it finish just running through its bench right there. It's going to probably affect the score, of course. Okay, so here we can see that kind of the stock score, and you can already see the previous one was 176, and now we're at 180. The encoding score was 139, so now it's 141. OpenCL, right? It's generally going to be fairly similar because it's more GPU sensitive. And also we had a different GPU right there, so that one you shouldn't really look at it. And then heavy multitasking is also going to be influenced a little bit by the fact that we have a different GPU, but it's also gone up. The others are CPU dependent, right? And so here, even if you just were to look at kind of these comparative values, I can go right here to this one, and you can also see this was from another run of AIOC once it had really gone to its maximum levels of fine-tuning everything. And we can see 196 and 154, so there was even still additional headroom. And so that's the really kind of powerful part about AIOC is you saw that literally all I needed to do was just enable one option within the UEFI to be able to take advantage of that. And the great thing is, again, like I said, this is on everything from our entry-level ROG Strix Z490-A board all the way up to our flagship series, but there's also all those rich manual options that I talked to you about. So it's entirely up to you. And again, if we go back into the UEFI, I'll show you one last set of values that you have available to you. You could adjust, and that wraps up my quick demo. And if you guys have any more questions, because we've really only kind of just touched on some of these aspects in terms of overclocking, strongly recommend check us out on our PC DIY Facebook group so that you can get into everything you're kind of interested in. But let me just lastly reboot, and we'll go from there. I'll show you just how it ultimately looks inside the UEFI. And I think this is the important part to keep in mind, is that while this also could be actually fully executed within quote-unquote software within AI Suite 3. You could just start the AIOC. You would never even have to go into the UEFI. You could literally just click a button in the AIOC in Windows, and it would do the whole thing for you. And sometimes there's convention, it's software-based overclocking. It is working on a hardware level because it's making all these adjustments through the firmware in the actual BIOS. So in that regard, this is just like if you were manually overclocking. And you can see right here, it's got this overclock at 21%. And you can see your cooler has been somewhat characterized, right? So it's actually asking us right there, do we want to stop? Or do you want to kind of keep letting it go a little bit further through kind of more tests? And it might get a little bit more aggressive, or it might come down a little bit. It depends on how that cooler score ends up kind of being coded. So that's telling you right there, what are you happy with essentially with the overclock, or do you want to kind of stop it? And so right there, I could essentially keep one to F1. So I'm going to tell it F1, and that would allow me to keep going essentially within my overclock, right? So it's really kind of as dynamic or as functional as you want to essentially take it. It's very, very flexible. So right here, you can see that we have our predictive values right there. They've all been set in that right-hand section. Like I said, and if you want more information, then all you would need to do is head over to essentially this area right here, and you'll see everything kind of broken down to you. And if, like I said, you wanted to make an adjustment, let's say you wanted to make changes yourself, the really cool part to all this is that we give you that flexibility to make these adjustments and have the actual predictive scale compensate for them for you. So an example right here is if I went to the core ratio and I went to just sync all cores, for example, but I just wanted to see how this little predictive table would approximate things, I could put in 4.8, and you will see right there that it will now give me the values for 4.8. I wanted to do, 49 on all cores, so that would guarantee me even one step above the max turbo, single turbo, and then all that, then it would give me the corresponding values. And you can see how those values all changed in real time. So even if you didn't want to use our AOC, you could still use that prediction table as a reference baseline and then make the corresponding adjustments. So that is pretty much, I think, a recap for or at least our overclocking inside a lot of different aspects of what we talked about here. There's a lot to kind of dive into, but hopefully you've found this interesting and useful. And thank you guys for checking out the stream. It's been super exciting to be able to walk you through this and be able to provide you an insight into how I think we provide really the most seamless and the best overclocking experience. If you want to get your most out of your 10th gen CPU, then you want to pair it up with an Asus Z490 based part. So thank you guys so much for checking out this stream. If you haven't got any questions, I'll double check it. I'll double check right there and make sure if there's something that's kind of hanging. If not, I'll check out the Discord a little bit later. My name in there is Asus Tech Marketing JJ. If you guys are watching this, hopefully on a replay or something like that, like I said, make sure to check out our PC DIY Facebook group. I'm an admin in there, and I answer a lot of questions. We've also got a great set of users in there that can give you insights on getting the most out of your parts. ROG Realbench will be linked as well. Like I said, that's a free application along with XTU. Great tools to be able to easily take the most out of your system. And also check out our EdgeUp website. It's edgeup.asus.com, where we actually sometimes occasionally will post guides in written form to give you insights on kind of performance tuning parameters for motherboards and for CPUs and things like that. So again, trying to give you as many resources as we can. So thank you guys so much for checking out this stream. Really appreciate it. Hopefully everybody stays safe, stay healthy, enjoy the rest of your day, and you guys take care, take it easy.